You'll pay the parking assessment like every other resident, or we tow. That curb belongs to the association, not to you." That was Brenda Castle, president of the Lantern Ridge Homeowners Association for 9 years running, standing in the middle of a public road telling me I owed her money to leave my own truck in front of my own house. The road was Quarry Bend Lane. The house was mine. And the woman in the white linen blazer had no more authority over that strip of asphalt than she had over the weather. What she did not know, what she never once bothered to check in the 3 years she spent billing me, was that the road she claimed to own had never been deeded to the association at all. It had never been deeded to the county either. I knew exactly who held the title to Quarry Bend Lane, because I had spent my working life reading documents like the one that proved it. So let me ask you something before I go any further. If a woman with a clipboard and a tow truck told you that breathing the air on your own street came with a monthly fee, what would you have done? My name is Walter Pine. I was 62 years old that spring, a retired title examiner who spent 31 years at a county recorder's office, and then a regional title company, reading deeds and plats and easement grants until the language of land became the only language I fully trusted. I bought the house on Quarry Bend Lane with my wife Fay after I retired, a single-story place at the dead end of a short road on the western edge of Lantern Ridge, where the subdivision ran out of money in the recession and never quite finished. Fay picked it for the quiet and for the big window in the kitchen that caught the morning light. She died of a stroke 14 months after we moved in, and I kept the house because leaving it felt like leaving her, and because my son Cole had moved in to finish high school after his mother passed, and he had nowhere steady to be. Cole was 16 that spring. He was a quiet kid with his mother's habit of watching before he spoke, and he had taken to recording things on his phone the way some kids doodle just to have something in his hands. He recorded the river when it was high. He recorded the neighbors' horses. He recorded me at the bench in the garage, narrating under his breath like a nature show. And I pretended to be annoyed and was not. I want you to remember that habit of his, because it matters later. For now, know only that he was safe, that he was mine, and that the boy never once stopped being the reason I kept my temper when every cell in my body wanted to lose it. I should tell you where the documentation habit came from, because it is the spine of everything that follows. For 31 years, my job was to find the flaw in a chain of title before money changed hands. A missed easement, a forged signature 2 owners back, a road that was paved but never deeded. I learned early that memory is worthless and paper is everything, that the person who keeps the dated record holds the high ground in any dispute, no matter how loud the other side gets. Fay used to tease me about it. She said I filed our life the way I filed strangers' land, that I had a folder for the roof warranty and a folder for the dog shots, and a folder, she suspected, for my folders. She was not wrong. When she died, the only thing that held me together for a while was the ordinary motion of keeping things in order, labeling, dating, putting the right paper in the right place. So when the trouble started, I did not have to learn a new discipline. I already had 30 years of it in my hands, and a manila folder felt as natural to me as a coffee cup. The street itself was the strange part, and the strangeness is the whole story. Lantern Ridge was platted in 2 phases. The first phase, where Brenda and the established families lived, had proper dedicated streets that the developer had signed over to the county for maintenance back when the project began. The second phase, my phase, was where the developer went bankrupt. Quarry Bend Lane and 2 stub roads near it had been graded and paved and then simply abandoned in the legal sense. The dedication was never completed. The county never accepted them. The HOA's own governing documents, the ones recorded at the courthouse, described their common area by metes and bounds. and those descriptions stopped a full 200 feet short of my property line. I had read all of it before I ever signed the purchase agreement, the way you check a parachute before you jump. So when the first notice came, I was not confused. I was almost amused. It arrived on a Tuesday in March, taped to my front door in a plastic sleeve, printed on association letterhead with Brenda's signature at the bottom and the association seal embossed in the corner like a coin. It announced a new street use and parking assessment of $40 per month for any vehicle parked on association roadways, effective immediately, with a late fee of $15 and a towing provision for non-compliance. I read it twice, standing on my own porch in the cold, and the second reading was slower than the first, because I wanted to be sure I was not misreading entitlement for authority. I was not. Then I walked it out to my truck, took a photograph of it in the plastic sleeve still taped to the door, took a second photograph of the truck parked legally at my own curb, and started a folder. A plain manila folder, the kind I had filled by the thousands in my working life. I wrote the date on the tab in block letters and underlined it. I did not call Brenda. I did not knock on a single door. I filed it. That was incident 1. I knew the discipline because the discipline had been my whole career. You do not argue with a bad document. You collect it, you date it, you set it beside the document that beats it, and you wait for the right room. The right room is never your own front yard. The right room has a neutral party in it, and a record that outlives the argument. I had spent 3 decades watching people lose winnable fights because they shouted in the wrong room. I was not going to be one of them. The first conversation, if you can call it that, happened a week later. I was carrying groceries from the truck when Brenda came up the road in her golf cart, a white one with the association seal on the side, and her name stenciled under the windshield. She had on the linen blazer and the kind of sunglasses people wear when they want to be seen, not needing to see. She stopped the cart at the foot of my driveway and did not get out. "Mr. Pine, you're past due on the parking assessment," she said. $40 plus the $15 late fee. I'll need that today, or I'll have to escalate. I set the groceries down on the tailgate. "Brenda, the association doesn't own this road. Your common area ends back at the Henson property. This stretch was never dedicated to anyone." She smiled the way you smile at a child who has gotten the rules wrong. "Everything inside the Lantern Ridge boundary is functionally part of our jurisdiction, Mr. Pine. The map is very clear." "The plat is very clear," I said. "It's just not clear the way you think it is." $55, she said. "Today." Then she backed the cart in a wide arc and drove off. And I stood there in my own driveway, holding a bag of oranges. And I understood that this was not going to be a misunderstanding I could correct with a friendly word. This was going to be a campaign. So I did the only sensible thing. I went inside and I pulled the recorded plat and the association's covenants from the box in my office. And I read them again, line by line, the way I had read them the first time, looking for any clause I'd missed. There was none. The road was not theirs. I filed Brenda's visit as Incident 2, with the date and the dollar figure and her exact words, and I went on with my evening. Cole asked me at dinner why the HOA lady kept coming around. I told him the truth, in the plainest version I had. "Somebody made a mistake about who owns the street," I said, "and they would rather double down than check." He asked if we were going to get towed. I told him no. He asked how I could be sure. I told him that I had read the paper, and the paper was older than her opinion, and in the end, paper older than an opinion almost always wins. He seemed to file that away the same way I file things. He was his mother's son. The notices became a rhythm after that, The second month brought a second notice with the late fee compounded, taped to the door in its plastic sleeve in the same spot. And I photographed it and filed it without breaking stride on my way to the truck. The third month brought a third, and by then Cole had started checking the door before I did, peeling the sleeve off and handing it to me at breakfast like the morning paper. We did not talk much about it. It had become weather. By June, the association sent a formal demand letter from a lawyer in the county seat, a man named Doyle France, whose name I recognized from years of title work as the kind of attorney who sends letters by the pound and bills for each one. The letter ran 2 pages to say what a sentence could have said. It demanded $190 in accumulated assessments and fees, and threatened a lien against my property if I did not pay within 30 days. I read it at the kitchen table with my coffee. I read it the way I had read 10,000 letters meant to frighten people who did not know their own ground. Then I photographed it and filed it. That was incident 5, if you were counting, and I was always counting. A lien was the first thing that gave me pause. Not because it frightened me, but because it told me something about Brenda I had only suspected. A lien is a public record. To file one, she would have to swear, in a recorded instrument, that the association had a valid basis for the charge. She was willing to put her false claim into the permanent record of the county. People who are bluffing do not do that. People who are bluffing fold when a lawyer's letter goes unanswered. Brenda was not bluffing. Brenda believed it. And a person who believes a false thing strongly enough to record it is a person who will eventually overreach so far that the record itself becomes the rope. I did answer the lawyer's letter once, in writing, because the record should show that I gave them the chance to check. I sent Mr. France a short letter stating that the roadway in question was never dedicated to or accepted by the association or the county, that the association's recorded common area description excluded it by a full 200 feet, and that I would be happy to provide the relevant book and page references on request. I kept it dry. I did not argue. I cited the documents by type, not by adjective, the way you state a fact you are willing to be tested on. I mailed it certified, kept the green card when it came back with an illegible signature, and filed a copy with the card stapled to it. Incident 6. The reply, when it came 3 weeks later, did not address a single point I had raised. It did not mention the dedication. It did not mention the recorded description. It simply restated the demand and added a new month of charges, as though I had written to ask for the total rather than to correct the premise. That non-answer was, to me, the most revealing document in the whole folder. They had been told exactly where to look, in plain language, by a man who plainly knew the territory, and they had refused to look. A refusal like that is not laziness. It is a decision. That decision was going to cost them everything, though it would be another year before they understood that. It was around then that I learned why Brenda cared so much about a dead-end road that her own paperwork said she did not own. Her husband was a man named Garrett Castle. I had seen him maybe twice. A heavy-set man in golf shirts who drove a black SUV with a dealer frame from 2 counties over. What I had not known, until a neighbor named Ruth mentioned it over the back fence one evening, was that Garrett Castle ran a development company, and that the development company had recently optioned the old quarry parcel that sat directly behind the second phase, behind my house, accessible only by one road. You can guess which road. Quarry Bend Lane was the sole legal access to 14 acres that Garrett wanted to turn into a gated cluster of luxury cabins. Without that road, the quarry parcel was landlocked and nearly worthless. With it, it was a development worth several $1 million. And there it was. The parking assessment was never about parking. The whole point was to establish in writing, month after month, that the association controlled Quarry Bend Lane. If they could build a paper record of charging for and managing that road, they could later argue the association had assumed ownership of it by long use and maintenance. And then the association, run by Brenda, could grant Garrett the access easement his project needed. The $40 a month was not a fee. It was a land grab dressed up as a parking ticket, and I was the only thing standing in the road. Ruth told me one more thing that evening that I wrote down the moment I got inside. She said Garrett had been to 2 county planning meetings already, presenting site plans for the cabin development as though the access question were settled. He was telling investors the road was locked up. He was selling something he did not have. I filed Ruth's account with the date and her exact words, and I noted that I would need to confirm it independently before it meant anything, because a fence line story is not evidence. It pointed me where to look, though, and where to look is half the work. What I did next took patience, and patience is the part of this nobody likes to hear about. I went to the courthouse, to the very recorder's office where men I had trained still worked, and I pulled the entire chain of title for both the roadway and the quarry parcel. I am not going to pretend it was hard for me. It was the easiest thing in the world for me. It was the thing I had done 10,000 times. I knew which clerk to ask and which index volumes to start in and how to read a bulk conveyance that ran 9 pages of exhibits where the thing you wanted was buried in Exhibit C. I spent 2 full days at the long oak table by the window where I'd eaten 1,000 lunches, with the same green-shaded lamps and the same smell of old paper and toner, pulling books off the shelf and laying photocopies in order until the chain was complete and unbroken in front of me. A clerk named Priya, a young woman I had trained myself before I retired, brought me coffee in a paper cup the second afternoon and looked over my shoulder at the spread of documents and said, "You're working a road, Walter." "Whose?" I told her mine, more or less. She left me to it. The roadway tract, it turned out, had never left the hands of the original developer's holding company on paper. When that company dissolved in bankruptcy, its remaining real property, including the unbuilt roadway tracts, had been conveyed in a bulk sale to a liquidation trust, and the conveyance was right there in Exhibit C, dated and recorded and signed, the kind of thing nobody reads to the end. The trust still held title. The road belonged to a trust that had forgotten it owned it. Not to Brenda, not to the county, not to anyone who knew or cared. That was the moment the whole thing turned over in my hands. The way a lock turns when you finally seat the right key. Brenda did not own the road. Somebody did, though. And that somebody could sell it. I am going to step out of the story for one moment, because this is the part I most want you to carry away. And then I will get right back to the road and the golf cart and the tow truck. A man in my position is tempted to keep fighting to prove a negative, to keep saying you do not own this, to keep playing defense for years while the other side keeps swinging. I did not want to play defense. I had played defense long enough to know it never ends, that you can win every single skirmish on your own street and still be standing there at 80 arguing with somebody's granddaughter. I wanted the deed. I wanted the question settled in the one place. Questions about land are ever truly settled, which is the recorded title itself. So before I tell you how it ended, ask yourself whether, in my place, you would have thought to stop arguing about who did not own the street and simply find out who did. Now back to it. Now, the summer brought the escalation I had been waiting for, because escalation always comes when a bluff is not paying off fast enough. In July, a towing company came at 6 in the morning and hooked my truck while it sat in front of my own house. Cole heard the diesel first. He came down the hall in his sweatshirt and shook my shoulder and said there was a truck taking the truck, which made no sense until I was at the window, and it made perfect sense. By the time I got my robe on and got outside, the flatbed had already lifted the front wheels off the pavement, and the whole rig was tilted nose down like a deer being hauled out of a field. The driver was a young man, with a clipboard of his own and a face that wanted to be anywhere else. He would not meet my eyes. I asked him on whose authority, and he handed me a work order signed by the association, Brenda's signature at the bottom, the same loop on the B that had been on every notice taped to my door. I did not yell at him, not. Yelling at the driver is yelling in the wrong room. I photographed the work order in my hand, then the truck on the bed, then the company name on the door panel, then the time on my phone, which read 6:04. Cole stood on the porch and recorded the whole thing without my asking, steady as a tripod, his thumb not even shaking. And I thought even then that his mother would have been proud of how still he held it. The flatbed pulled away with my truck, and the morning went quiet again, and the birds did not care. It cost me $340 to get it back from an impound lot 11 miles away, plus a day of my life and a ride from Ruth. And I filed every piece of it: the work order, the photographs, the impound receipt, the mileage. That was incident 11, and it was the first one that crossed from petty into something a court would care about, because they had taken my property off a road they did not own. The deputy I spoke with that day was a soft-spoken man named Hollis, heavyset, close to my own age, with a way of standing that said he had broken up 1,000 of these and enjoyed none of them. He came out because I called the non-emergency line and asked for a report, not to make an arrest, just to put the tow on the official record. He listened to the whole thing on my porch with his hat in his hand and his cruiser idling at the curb. And Cole brought him a glass of water without being asked. And Hollis thanked the boy and drank half of it before he spoke. Then he told me the truth that constrained him. "Mr. Pine, I can't referee a property dispute on the side of a road," he said. "If they've got a signed work order and they claim authority, that's a civil matter until a court says otherwise. I'd be overstepping if I told that tow company to stand down, and then I'd be the one in front of a judge." He turned his hat in his hands. "What I can tell you is, you build a record. Every incident, dated. You get enough of a pattern, and you get the ownership question answered by somebody with the authority to answer it. A court or a clerk or a recorded deed. And then I've got something I can act on. Until then, my hands are tied, and I won't lie to you about it." He gave me a case number for the tow, written on the back of his card in pencil. I told him I had been building exactly that record since March, that I had a folder with dates and photographs and a certified copy of the recorded plat. He looked at me a little differently then. He almost smiled. He said, "Then you're ahead of most folks. Most folks come to me with a story and no paper." I filed his words in his card, and I understood I had just met the man who would pivot the day I handed him a fact he could stand on. By August, the towing had happened twice more, and each time Cole recorded it, and each time I paid the lot and filed the paper. The second tow came on a Saturday at dawn, and the third on a weekday afternoon while I was inside paying bills. And I came out to an empty space at the curb and a hairline of fresh fluid on the asphalt where the truck had been. Each time the cost was a little different, and the indignity was the same. The pattern Brenda was building for herself, the pattern of an association exercising control over a road, was the same pattern I was building against her. Except mine was dated and witnessed, and hers was a lie. She came up the road in the cart after the third tow, triumphant, certain she was wearing me down. The blazer that day was a pink so bright it looked like it had its own light source, and she had her sunglasses pushed up on her head and her phone in a glittered case in one hand. "This stops being a problem the day you start paying like a member of this community," she said, leaning out of the cart. "You are functionally inside our jurisdiction, Mr. Pine, whatever you tell yourself. Garrett's people have walked that road with the county. It's settled." "Nothing about that road is settled," I said. "It will be," she said, and she smiled. And for the first time, I let her see me write something down. She liked that. She thought it meant she'd finally gotten to me. It meant the opposite. She had just told me, in front of my recording son, that Garrett's people had walked the road with the county, which was the admission I needed that the parking fee and the development were the same animal. I filed it as Incident 14, with her exact words and the date and the detail of the glittered phone case, because in my experience, the small, true details are the ones that make a record believed. Then I made a phone call I had been preparing for since the courthouse. I called the liquidation trust. It took a month to reach the right person. I left messages that were not returned, was transferred to departments that did not exist anymore, and finally landed, on a Wednesday morning, with a trust officer at a bank in the state capital named Marcy, who handled the dissolved developer's remaining assets. I explained, in the careful language she would understand, that her trust held title to a paved roadway tract that it was very likely not aware of, that the tract was generating no income and carrying a small annual tax liability, and that I was a private party interested in purchasing it outright for cash. I gave her the book and page and the legal description and the parcel number, slowly, so she could write it down. I heard her keyboard clicking. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said the words that ended Brenda Castle's 9-year reign, without either of us knowing it yet. "Well, look at that," she said. "You're right. We do own that. Nobody's ever asked about it." There was something almost delighted in her voice, the pleasure of an accountant finding a coin in the couch. She told me the trust would be glad to sell a non-performing asset, that they would need a clean appraisal and board approval, and that it would take some weeks. I told her I was a patient man. I had a folder that proved it. The purchase closed in October. I paid the trust $18,000 for the entire length of Quarry Bend Lane, every inch of pavement from the Henson property to the dead-end turnaround, including the unbuilt right-of-way that ran behind my house and across the only access to Garrett Castle's quarry parcel. The deed was recorded at the county on a Thursday morning. I stood at the same counter where I had spent my career, and a younger clerk I had trained named Priya stamped it into the record and slid me a certified copy, and she looked at the legal description and then at me and said, "Walter, isn't this the road behind your place?" I told her it was. She said, "The HOA's been telling everybody they manage that." I told her they had. She handed me the copy and said, "Well, they don't now." I put the certified deed in the front of the manila folder, ahead of every notice and lien and tow receipt, the newest paper on top of 3 years of older paper. And I closed the folder, and I drove home down the middle of my own street, slow the way you drive on a road you own. I did not tell Brenda. I did not tape a notice to her door or send the lawyer a letter. The discipline holds all the way to the end, or it is not discipline. I waited for the right room, and the right room was coming, because the association had scheduled its quarterly open meeting for the second Tuesday in November in the clubhouse, and the agenda Ruth showed me over the fence included an item titled Quarry Bend Access and the Castle Development Proposal. Brenda was going to stand up in front of her members and the county planner and grant Garrett the easement across the road. She was going to do it in public, on the record, with a county official present. She had built me the perfect room and addressed the invitation herself. I went to the meeting with Cole beside me and the folder under my arm. The clubhouse smelled of coffee and floor wax. Maybe 40 residents in folding metal chairs that scraped the tile. Garrett up front with a foam board site plan on an easel. The cabins drawn in tidy clusters along a road that had my name on the deed in my lap. Ms. Okafor, the county planner, sat to one side with a binder and a county lanyard, taking notes. Doyle France, the lawyer, stood near the wall in a gray suit, checking his phone. Brenda was at the head table in a magenta blazer with a gavel she did not need and used anyway, tapping it to bring a room to order that was already quiet. I knew most of the faces in those chairs. Ruth was 3 rows up. The Hensons were near the door. These were not bad people. They were people who had been told for years that the woman with the gavel knew the rules. And most of them had never once had reason to check. She ran through the routine business with the brisk pleasure of a woman who loved the sound of her own order. The landscaping bid, the pool key reissue, the reminder about trash can setback. Then she came to the quarry item. She stood. She described the castle development as a tremendous opportunity for property values, the words coming out smooth and rehearsed. She said the association would be granting an access easement along Quarry Bend Lane to facilitate the project, and that the road, which the association had managed for years, was the association's to grant. She actually gestured toward me in the 3rd row, the difficult resident who had refused to pay his fair share. And a few heads turned, and she said it with a little smile, the smile of someone setting up a punchline at a man's expense. Some of us understand that this road belongs to the community. I raised my hand. She loved that too. She called on me the way a teacher calls on a slow student to make an example. I stood. I did not make a speech. I have heard 1,000 people lose by making speeches. I held up the certified copy of the deed so Ms. Okafor could see it. And I spoke to her, not to Brenda, because she was the neutral authority in the room and the only person whose recognition mattered. Ms. Okafor, my name is Walter Pine. I own the property at the end of Quarry Bend Lane. I'd like to enter into the record that the association cannot grant an easement across this road, because the association does not own it. I set the deed on the table in front of her. This is a deed recorded at the county on the 16th of October. It conveys the full length of Quarry Bend Lane, including the right-of-way behind the proposed development. To me, in fee simple. The road was never dedicated to the association or the county. It was held by a liquidation trust, and the trust sold it to me. The book and page are right there. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone realizes at the same moment that the floor has shifted. Ms. Okafor picked up the deed. She read it the way people who read deeds for a living read them, fast and then slow. She looked up at Garrett. She looked at the lawyer. Then she set the deed down and said, in the flat voice of a professional delivering a fact, "If this is recorded as stated, the association has no interest to convey here. The county can't process an easement from a party that doesn't hold title. Mr. Castle, the access for your parcel runs across privately owned land." She turned to Brenda. "Ma'am, has the association verified its ownership of this roadway?" Brenda's mouth opened, and nothing came out for a long moment. Garrett was already on his feet, looking at his lawyer, and the lawyer was looking at the deed, and the lawyer's face had gone the color of the wall. 40 residents sat in folding chairs and watched the woman who had towed my truck 3 times realize she had spent 3 years and a lawyer and a lien building a case for her own husband's project on top of a road that, it turned out, I had bought out from under her in October for $18,000. Nobody said anything for a moment that felt very long. I picked up my deed and sat down. The numbers, when they settled, were these. In 3 years, the association had charged me, fined me, and towed me for a total of $1,420, every cent of it for the use of a road they did not own. Fines collected from me that they were entitled to keep, 0. Garrett Castle had spent, by the figure that came out later in the lawsuit, just under $200,000 on engineering, options, and planning for a development that was now landlocked behind 1 mile of asphalt with my name on the deed. He had pre-sold cabin lots to investors on the promise of access he never had. The quarry parcel he had optioned for a fortune was worth almost nothing without my road, and my road was not for sale to him at any price, and he knew it. And so did the investors he had to call. The consequence fell exactly where Brenda had aimed her overreach. She had wanted the road in order to deliver it to Garrett. The road instead became the thing that exposed Garrett, because the investors who had been promised settled access now had a fraud claim. And a fraud claim against a developer pulls the planning file. And the planning file showed 2 presentations in which Garrett had represented the access as secured when it never was. The county opened a review. Ms. Okafor, who did not enjoy being the official in the room when a fraudulent representation surfaces on her watch, was the one who flagged the prior presentations, and a junior planner who had taken the original meeting. Minutes confirmed in writing that Garrett had stated the road was locked up. The investors sued, 3 of them, for the deposits they had put down on cabin lots that could never be built. The association, having recorded a lien on my property based on a roadway it did not own, faced a quiet title and slander of title action of my own that its insurer settled within 90 days rather than litigate. And part of that settlement was the removal of the lien and a payment that more than covered every tow and fee I had ever paid. Doyle France, the lawyer who sent letters by the pound, stopped returning the association's calls once the word fraud entered the file. Brenda was voted out as president at the next meeting, not with drama, just with a show of hands by neighbors who had finally seen the paperwork. A quiet count of raised arms in a room that had deferred to her for 9 years. The development never broke ground. The quarry parcel sat empty behind my house, 14 acres of scrub and old stone, and the only road to it stayed mine, and stayed quiet, which is all it had ever needed to be. I want to tell you about the evening after the meeting, because that is the part I keep, not the part about the lawsuits. Cole and I drove home down Quarry Bend Lane in the truck that had been towed 3 times, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "You really just bought the whole street." I said I had. He said, "Mom would have thought that was funny." And he was right. She would have. She would have laughed her low laugh and shaken her head. And for a moment in the cab of that truck, she was almost there with us. We pulled into the driveway. The kitchen window caught the last of the light the way it had the morning Faye pick the house. Cole went in to heat up dinner. I stood in my own driveway, on my own street, and I did not feel triumphant, which surprised me. I felt the way you feel when a thing is simply finished and filed and correct. I went inside. The folder sat on the kitchen table where I had left it, fat with 3 years of dated paper and 1 deed on top, and I did not open it again. There was no longer any reason to. So here is the lesson, plainly, because you came this far, and you have earned the practical part. When somebody with a title and a clipboard tells you they have authority over your property, do not argue with them on the street. Go to the courthouse and pull the record yourself. Find out who actually holds title, because it is almost never who is shouting at you. And the answer is sitting in a book at the recorder's office that anyone is allowed to read. Date everything, photograph everything, keep the folder. A calm record beats a loud opinion every single time, and a recorded deed beats them both. And if you ever find that the thing they are fighting you for is a thing nobody truly owns, do not just defend it. Go and buy it, and put your name on the paper, and let the paper do the talking. If you have a story like this, an HOA or a board or an office that reached past its own fence line, tell me about it in the comments, because I read them and I learned from them. Subscribe if you want more of these, the long quiet ones where the deed wins in the end. And next time, I will tell you about the widow 2 valleys over whose HOA fined her for the wildflowers on her own septic field, right up until the day the state told them what that field really was. Until then, walk your boundaries and read your paper.